I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to this seminar to Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. This lecture series is possible because of the generous support of the patrons of this channel. In fact, this entire channel is an experiment in crowd-funded university-level education made accessible completely for free. Open access, no paywalls. Access to reliable scholarly education on any topic shouldn't plunge anybody into thousands of dollars of debt, and I'm committed to making topics that I have expertise in and the history of Western esotericism as accessible to the public as possible. That said, if you benefit from the channel or from this course, I'd ask you to please consider supporting the channel for the production of free courses like this via a yearly contribution to my Patreon for as little as like $54 a year. It's basically a cup of coffee a month. But I genuinely appreciate your consideration for supporting this channel and making this kind of educational content possible. But to be clear, I am grateful for the work that I'm able to do, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this open access seminar, To Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. All right, everyone, welcome back to a lost episode of the Merkavah Mysticism seminar. Unfortunately, the lecture that I'm about to re-record was devoured by the monster that is Google, and that recording was lost. I still have yet to recover it, and Google has not been terribly helpful in this regard. But that can't get in the way of getting done what needs to get done. And in order to make sense of the subsequent recorded lectures, well, I just need to re-record this one rather than waiting on Google to deliver the one that was lost. So here we are. So this lecture picks up on the previous one on the qualifications and the praxes of the Merkavah. I think a topic that is probably perhaps the most interesting to most people watching this. But what we need to shift to now in order to get to make some sense of why do all of this, and one of the things that we can all point out here is that the Merkavah mysticism is among the most grueling, if not the most grueling system in the West. I don't know of any other system in terms of acuteness. Of course, there are lifelong forms of monasticism, which are grueling in their own way, but the Merkavah mysticism is uniquely grueling in its acuity. And one must look at just how difficult it is to qualify for the praxis, how difficult it is to perform the praxis, and how difficult it is to actually engage in the praxis in the mythscape without being ripped apart or destroyed or burned alive, or the various forms of heinous and horrifying execution that one faces in the world of the Merkavah. The enduring question in all of this simply must be, why in the world would one do any of this? It seems extremely difficult to qualify, extremely difficult to do it, and lethal if you make any mistakes. Why in the world would anyone do this? What is the point of all of this mishigas? And so what we have to look at in the literature are some of the hints, and they're mostly just hints, about what one is to receive in the final result of having gazed at the divine throne or beheld the king in his beauty. And one of our greatest hints at that, which I'll come back to in just a minute, are the so-called Gedulah hymns, which are found at the very beginning of Hekhalot Rabbati in Synopsis 81 to 86. So we'll circle back to those in just a moment. But the guiding question of this lecture is, what in the world are the end results of doing this? What does one get for having beheld the king in his glory, for having gazed at the Merkavah? So the first justification that one seems to get is just the process of angelification itself. Judaism, as you probably know, is a religion that has long valued, going all the way back to the biblical text and into the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is a text, or a religion rather, that greatly values ritual purity and moral uprightness. It's a religion founded around very scrupulous practices of ritual purity and moral law. And those together are just amplified in the praxis of angelification so that one can enter into the world of the Merkavah. Again, the whole part of the qualifications and the praxis itself are to angelify you such that you can go into the realm you're not normally supposed to be able to go. The world of the Hekhalot, the world of where primarily the angels dwell. So in some sense, the praxis itself is a goal. If you can achieve that level of ritual, moral, and educational purification and uprightness, that is in a sense a goal in itself. It's just an extreme athletic version of Judaism. It's the kind of thing where people aren't content to do marathons. They have to go do ultra marathons where they run for 4 days straight in the middle of Appalachia or in the Mojave Desert or something. It's just an extreme version of the ideas already to be found in Judaism. But of course, this comes at a sort of paradoxical in a paradoxical way, because typically in rabbinic thinking, one isn't allowed to become overly pious. There's a great quotation from Kohelet and from Ecclesiastes where it says that one should not become overly pious. And the rabbis are suspect to a significant degree of someone who becomes so pious that they remove themselves from the norms of the community. And this is a place where the Merkavah mysticism is unusual in that it seems to remove one from the norms of the community. Just to point out the most obvious example here is that if one is engaging in the kind of fast that lasts for 40 days, where you're only preparing bread that you've made on your own and you're not drinking wine, the question is, how are you even observing the Sabbath? Because the Sabbath usually is observed in community with wine and with bread, typically made by someone else. So, how does one even observe the Sabbath, which is in many ways the most important holiday in the Jewish calendrical cycle, despite the fact that it occurs every week? Secondly, even prayer is interrupted by one engaging in this kind of radical, extreme ascetic practice, because prayer in Judaism requires a minyan, it requires a quorum of 10 people. And if you're isolated by yourself for 12 days or 40 days in this cycle of fasting and prayer, how are you able to maintain an appropriate prayer life? So there's something about this extreme purity and righteousness, which in many ways seems heterodox compared to normative Orthodox Judaism. So that's one sort of, again, paradox. One of we've encountered many of these kinds of paradoxes in the very heart of the Merkavah mysticism, whereas it seems to, on the one hand, encourage a kind of radical righteousness, but it's exactly that kind of radical righteousness that normative rabbinical Judaism would have actually been very skeptical about. But another aspect of the praxis is it seems like that once one has achieved this angelification, that angelification can, at least in one case, the case of Enoch, it can go all the way into full tilt angelification. You can literally be turned into an angel. And so, insofar as being transformed into an angel is a goal that one has in life, I don't know if your life goals involve being transformed into an angel. The Hekhalot literature and the Merkavah mysticism seem to allow for at least a possibility of that. However, the only person that is permanently turned into an angel in this literature is, of course, Hanoch, is of course Enoch. But at least it's a possibility in this kind of mysticism. So the angelification process seems to be core to this, and it seems to be a goal in itself, both for its elevation, the elevation of the human being, but also once one arrives in the world of the Hekhalot in this angelified state, it seems that one has a significantly higher degree of the ability to interact with the angels and perhaps even manipulate them to some degree, as we'll see in just a minute. But the core thing that one wants to achieve in all of these ordeals and such is to be able to enter into the divine throne room and to gaze at the divine chariot throne, as we've said many, many times throughout the seminar, or to say to see it, to see the king in his beauty, as it's denoted in Isaiah. And this is interesting because it only seems to be possible, according to the Hekhalot literature, by human beings. Angels, for reasons that aren't totally clear, aren't able to see the king in his beauty. Angels, what they have to do is, as the king, as God, the divine, is looking out into the throne room, the angels cover their face. They can't endure the sacred radiation that, even with their eyes closed, burns their face and ultimately causes them to have to be purified in the river of the Region. So even the being basked in the divine radiation somehow falls them over and damages them in some kind of way. But certainly they're not able to look at the king when the king has the king's eyes open. The angels must cover their face. And further, when the angels open up their wings and look at the direction of the king in his beauty has his eyes closed and his face covered. And so this is what Schaeffer refers to as the game of divine peekaboo. That anytime the divine is gazing, the angels cannot, or anytime the angels are gazing, the divine cannot be seen. Therefore, the angels operate in this dialectical relationship with the divine, such that neither ever see each other, despite the fact that they are, in many ways, completely proximate in the most radical sense, metaphysical sense possible. They're right there in the room together, and they never see one another. This isn't true for human beings. Human beings, for reasons that the text never completely articulates, human beings are able to gaze at the divine throne. And that gazing at the divine throne, to seeing the king in his beauty, this seems to be an end in itself. And the text, interestingly enough, never fully describes what happens after one experiences this glimpse of the divine. Is one transformed? Is one or do you get altered in some kind of fundamental way? And so one of the interesting things about this idea is that it seems that being able to gaze at the king in his glory allows one to be transformed in some kind of way. And exactly what kind of transformation occurs isn't clear at all. So the text is very conspicuously quiet on the nature of this transformation. But that is the transformation that one is seeking. That is the mystical end in itself. But exactly the nature of what happens in that transformation, the text is opaque about. However, again, one is obligated, if one is engaging in the Merkavah praxis, to actually go, and after experiencing this boom, one is obliged to go back into the community and tell other people what you have learned. So, on the one hand, we're not actually told what the Merkavah descenders see when they gaze upon the divine throne, and yet we have obligations that once they have achieved this, they are obliged to go back into the community and to testify, to teach what they have witnessed. Further, at least and most importantly in Hekhalot Rabbati, the most important thing is to be able to engage in what is the Schaeffer calls the unio liturgica, the mystical liturgical union, whereby Israel and Klal Yisrael and the angels join in a combined religious liturgy in the praise of the divine. And in some ways, this seems to be a mystical reparation of the destruction of the temple. Of course, the temple functioned as the central locale whereby human beings worshipped the one God, in a place, again, according to the Jewish imagination, where all of human beings worship the one God in the one place, with the one people, with the one high priest, etc., etc. But of course, with the destruction of the temple, that connection between Israel and the divine has been severed. And therefore, everything is done through substitution. You can't do sacrifices anymore. Therefore, one does substitutionary things like prayer. You can't offer up incense, so you do substitutions. You read the sacrifices if you can't offer them up. Everything is done through substitution. But insofar as the point of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple, was to directly connect our world with the divine world, that allowed for communication and praise to go up to the divine world and for divine blessings to come back down. The destruction of the temple has meant that has become severed. And so what we get in the ability to descend directly into the sacred precincts of the divine is the ability to directly sort of shortcut that problem. There's no earthly temple anymore, but that doesn't matter perhaps, because one can go into the celestial temple and engage in direct prayer with the angels directly in the throne room of God. And therefore, there was no necessity, there's no requirement for there to be an earthly temple anymore. So in some ways, this seems to be a solution for the intermittent period between the destruction of the second temple by the Romans and the coming of the Messiah and the construction of the third temple, whereby the descenders act as kind of proto-messianic characters entering into the divine throne room and, of course, praising the divine with the angels directly. So this seems to be a kind of, again, short circuit for dealing with this interim period after the destruction of the temple, but before the coming of the Messiah, through a direct mystic means of entering into the throne room and engaging with the angels in the Unio Liturgica. This is highlighted by the erotic imagery that gets used of the divine throne, that when Klal Yisrael, when the people of Israel are praying to God, God is imagined as bending over and embracing and caressing and kissing the face of Jacob, Israel, that's actually engraved on the throne of God, the God self. And so the act of prayer is also a kind of hieros gamos. Remember that in the Song of Songs, Israel is imagined as the feminine, God is imagined as the masculine, and the mystical read of the Song of Songs is a kind of hieros gamos, a kind of sacred marriage between God and Israel. This is accomplished through prayer, at least in the galut, in the exile, and that exact image occurs in pretty shocking detail, in pretty shocking homoerotic detail, in fact, in Hekhalot Rabbati. So that is again another place where one might have a connection between the point of all of this, that the mystical liturgical union is not just to do it for the sake of doing it, but it is a reunification. It is a tikkun, to use a bit of anachronistic Kabbalistic language. It is a rectification of a failure in the cosmic connection between Klal Yisrael and the divine. Another element that might be going on here as well is that and I should just mention this maybe just a little bit further, is that this idea of what to do with the galut, what to do with the exile, this is an important concept that will exist not only in Merkavah mysticism to some degree, but it becomes a huge topic of conversation in Kabbalah, especially later on in Lurianic Kabbalah. And further, that image of God sort of sitting on God's throne and then bending over in order to caress and kiss the visage of Jacob is an interesting image, because that is precisely the body posture that we learn from Hekhalot Zutarti and from the Haigon about how one is to comport one's body while one engages in the Hekhalot praxes. Remember that one sits with one's head between one's knees, staring at the earth, gazing at the earth, and whispering incantations at the earth. That seems to be the same body posture that the divine takes when the divine is unionized, when God is made one. God is subject to yichud, to oneness with Israel in the act of prayer and in the act of the unio liturgica. So there seems to be some kind of hieros gamos that's going on with engaging in shared prayer with the divine. And of course, that idea of Lashem Yichud, for the purpose of the unification of the divine name, that Kabbalistic idea will endure very well, or that idea will endure very much into Kabbalah and is still used in a Jewish prayer cycle down to this day. So again, I think underneath the hood of this is not just prayer for the sake of prayer with the divine, but there is a kind of short-circuiting of the galut, an ending, a mystical temporary ending of the galut, of the exile. Another skill or boon or power that one achieves while engaged in the Hekhalot praxis is some kind of ability to engage with angels. Now, in Davila, he talks about the ability to control angels or control spirits more generally. I don't read it quite that strongly. I don't think that we see in the Hekhalot literature the kind of binding power, the kind of control that one, for instance, has in the Solomonic tradition over and against demons with various sigils or divine names or angel names. I don't think that in the Hekhalot literature we ever get that kind of power over angels. I think the most you get is the ability of sort of a detente with them. Remember, the angels in the Hekhalot literature are notoriously hostile to human beings. I think the best that you get is that they don't bother you. I think the best that you get is at some level they're just not going to kill you. So I don't think that you bind them, and I certainly don't think that you control them. I think the best that you get is they leave you alone, or they might, in some cases, as we'll talk about in a moment, they might help you. But I think the angels that are going to help you are going to be a vanishingly small minority, whereas the rest of them, the best you get is that they simply ignore you or allow you to pass by showing you certain signs or sigils or divine names, but that's the best you get. So I don't think that you get control over the angels in the Hekhalot literature, but you do get them to relent of their power to otherwise strike you dead in all the creative ways in which the Hekhalot angels can murder you. But of course, this is all required to enter into and transverse the world of the Hekhalot. The angels don't want you there. You're not supposed to be there. You're not an angel. And therefore, you need to find some way to bypass them And therefore, there are these techniques, these adjurations, these divine names. There are other techniques by which to bypass these angels, or to have them usher you from one Hechal to the other, or to put you into the special chariot that takes you from one Hechal to the other. But there are ways to make them relent and allow you to pass. And so that's at the core of a lot of the adjurations and a lot of the more magical praxes that we find in the Hekhalot literature more general. But how are these angels placated? It seems like they're placated along a couple of different lines. The first is by one's merit. That is to say, one must be relatively righteous, one must be relatively learned in Torah, one must have the correct magical names of the angels. So there's several different things that one needs to have. One needs to have God, God's self, basically usher you in the case of Rabbi Akiva. But there are different things that one needs in order to bypass these angels. Some of which seem like they are merited, that is to say, you have earned the right to do it. Some of them are magical, and therefore they are mechanical in some sense. You simply show the right badge, the right seal, and you're able to bypass the angels. And some of them seem to be simply divine compassion, that the angels have every right to annihilate you, but God and God's mercy allows you to pass. Now, again, not all of the angels are hostile. Some of them are helpful. You think of Surya, the angel of the presence, Anaphiel, sort of an escorting angel, Azhaya is another escorting angel. Metatron also seems to be especially helpful for descenders to transverse the mythscape of the Hekhalot. So there seems to be some of them that are relatively helpful. And further, some of them seem to even give you additional powers. It's like being leveled up if you get enough Hekhalot experience points, where you level up and angels give you certain kinds of powers and knowledge through the process. And we see some of this in Synopsis 421, where the angel Anaphiel provides you with various kinds of esoteric knowledge and even grants you wishes via various adjurations. So this is a place where an angel is not only not directly antagonizing you, but even seems to be giving you power-ups in order for you to transverse the world of the Hekhalot. Further, the other angels, like the Sarpanim, the angel of the angel of the face, the angel of the presence, also will grant you cosmological secrets and access to the Maaseh Bereshit. Remember that the Maaseh Bereshit is a form of esoteric cosmological speculation, usually typified later on by texts like the Sefer Yetzirah. But the Sarpanim will give you access to these kind of cosmological secrets, at least as they're detailed at Synopsis 623. And again, as I mentioned, you're not binding these angels. These angels are extremely powerful, much, much more powerful than human beings. But there are a couple of places where I do want to note that there are some exceptions. You can see at Synopsis 627 and 634 and a couple other places where it does seem that angels can be bound to the human will. And even very powerful angels like Metatron can be bound to the human will. How exactly that happens is not clear. I think it primarily happens through the ability to use the divine name, Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, as a way of basically becoming deputized by the divine. And insofar as one is deputized by the divine, one is then able to use that authority to bind these angels and basically compel them to do what you want them to do. But that is the exception and definitely not the rule. Demons are rarely mentioned in the Hekhalot literature. Shadim, they're very, pretty rarely mentioned, although they do come from time to time, and they're primarily mentioned in terms of how the Hekhalot literature or how the Hekhalot practice gives you some degree of protection from them, either or both while you are engaged in the descent, but especially after you have successfully done the descent. So one of the things that one gains, one might say, in having done the descent successfully is that one gains sort of a permanent protection, saving throw +5 against demonic attack. And we can see this at Synopsis 639, 560, and others, G21, Karaganese at 21. You can see these on the screen here on the slide. But it's worth pointing out that what's conspicuous and interesting about these kinds of protections is that the language of the protections very much mirrors or echoes the language of the incantation bowl literature. And of course, the incantation bowl literature is a Babylonian magical technology for binding and dismissing various demons, including Lilith most famously. Lilith here is depicted on the screen. But these incantation bowl literature has a very distinct type of stereotyped language that we see echoed in the Hekhalot literature. So this is a case that where the Hekhalot literature and the incantation bowl literature are talking to each other in some kind of way. And maybe the authors share some common knowledge, and perhaps even they were doing both. It's not really clear. But the kind of spirits or the kind of entities that one is protected from in the Hekhalot literature are ruchim, spirits, just more abstract spirits. These are sometimes spirits of the dead. Shadin, you'll notice this is the Sophet Nun being used in the plural here, so we're looking at a bit later Hebrew. But Shadin, right? So these are demons like Shadim. Lilim, notice that it is in plural, so it's not just Lilith, but Lilu spirits, Lilith spirits. And the incantation bowl literature knows of both male and female Lilith spirits, so it's not exclusively one specific Lilith, although she is known in that literature. Davim, Daves, of course, are Zoroastrian demons. And so here we have an influence from Zoroastrianism into the Hekhalot literature as well, but also Satanim. So Satanim, accusing angels. Notice here, we're not talking about Ha-Satan, the Satan. We're talking about a species of demons known as Satanim. And so we have a whole list. Again, these are often just listed in rote, but we have a whole list of various kinds of evil spirits for which the descender is to be protected. I should also mention in the literature, there's no mention of binding demons to one's will, as we will find, for instance, later in Solomonic magic, whereby various sigils and demonic names can bind a demon to your will, and you can force that demon to go find you buried treasure or get you a girlfriend or something. We don't see any of that in the Hekhalot literature at all. And as I mentioned, most of the demons that are in the rabbinical imagination at this time are primarily conceived of as pests. They're not thought of as fallen angels. They're not thought of as demons in the robust Christian sense, or even the Islamic sense. They're thought of mostly as something like pesky wild animals. They're vermin. They carry a kind of disease. They're associated with bathrooms and ruins. So they're not thought of as demons in the sense of a hulking demon that you might think of from a horror film. They're much more like a demonic pest or a kind of, I don't know, like an infestation more than anything else. But of course, there are ghosts in the rabbinical imagination, ruchim, ruchot, and there also other kinds of spirits, big demons like Asmodeus. Although even Asmodeus is thought of as being somewhat strangely pious in the rabbinical imagination. There's even a famous devil, a demon, a shade, the demon Rabbi Joseph. He's a demon named Joseph who becomes a rabbi. So the world of the demons in rabbinical Judaism is much more complex than it is in the Christian or the Islamic imagination, and therefore we should not apply Christian or Islamic stereotypes about demons to rabbinical demons because they are quite different. But here we even see the penetration of Zoroastrianism with the Davin in this text as well. But at any rate, the Hekhalot literature does provide you some degree of protection from these, or a significant degree of protection if you've successfully done it, from these entities. Further, the texts are not terribly interested in the afterlife either, and this should be relatively logically obvious. The kind of qualifications that one has to achieve in order to do the Hekhalot praxis is such that one is engaged in not just the practice of normative Judaism, but a kind of hyper Judaism. And insofar as simply keeping the commandments of normative rabbinical Judaism are more than sufficient for ensuring that one has a share in the world to come, this seems like it not only would you already have a share in the world to come in Olam Haba if you're able to achieve the qualifications for the praxis, but in many ways, angelification seems to make all of this redundant. That is just to say that if you have qualified for engaging in the Hekhalot praxis, you have well outstripped the qualifications necessary for getting a share in the world to come. So in many ways, getting a share in the world to come is just a no-brainer. It's a given. You just get it pass and go, because one has already achieved the qualifications for Olam Haba in the process of angelification. Another way of putting that, perhaps in perhaps a less convoluted way, is that by the time you've achieved the angelification sufficient to allow you into the world of the Hekhalot, you have already achieved the merit to the world to come. It is easier to achieve merit for the world to come than it is to achieve qualification to engage in the Hekhalot praxis. If you want an idea about just how difficult it is to qualify for the Hekhalot praxis, it is easier to get into heaven, the rabbinical idea of heaven and the afterlife, the good afterlife, way easier to do that than it is to engage in the qualifying praxes for the angelification to enter into the world of the Hekhalot. But again, the text is always going to be a bit surprising to us, and in several different places, we do see that the text does guarantee one a place in the world to come. We see at Synopsis 675 that Rabbi Ishmael says, blissful is the man who completes this raz, this mystery from dawn to dawn. He acquires this world and Olam Haba and the world to come and all of the world, the Olamim, and he merits greeting the future return of the presence of the Shekhinah. So this is quite a boon. You gain benefit in this world, which is to say parnasa. You gain basically a good life in this world, which is materially a good thing. You gain the world to come, Olam Haba. You gain Olamim. You gain all the worlds. So there are many other worlds in the rabbinical imagination aside from ours. You gain all those worlds. A little bit of a Mormon quality to that one. And you merit greeting the future return of the presence of the Shekhinah. So in some sense, you get kind of a front row seats to the Messianic period. So you gain this world, you gain all the worlds, you gain the world to come, and you gain front row seats to the return of the return to the presence of the Shekhinah, of the Messiah. So that's quite a grab bag of benefits that one achieves. Further, we learned that if one is successful at the descent, that one becomes a son of two worlds, namely Olam Hazeh, this world, and Olam Haba, the world to come. That you are said that you will dwell in Gan Eden, which is sort of the Garden of Eden. That you return to paradise. Again, you become a son of the world to come, and you merit a crown in both worlds. Again, in Olam Hazeh, in this world, and in Olam Haba, in the world to come. But as I mentioned, this all seems kind of redundant. Now, what it may be the case is that the Hekhalot praxis may guarantee you these things. You can always lose your place in the world to come. That is to say, I may merit my place in the world to come now, but I could lose that merit by engaging in idolatry or something. So maybe it's the case that somehow have the experience of seeing the king in his glory, that allows you to basically have an unshatterable faith or something, and it makes it such that you can never forfeit that merit in the world, in this world, in Olam Hazeh, for your access to Olam Haba. I'm not sure, but at any rate, at least on a straightforward reading of the question, it seems redundant, because as I said before, by the time that one has merited qualification for the Hekhalot praxis, in the rabbinical imagination, one has very much already achieved the merit one will require to having access to the world to come. It's much easier to get into the world to come, I think, in Judaism than it is, for instance, in heaven and hell in Islam and Judaism, or Islam and Christianity. But as I mentioned at the beginning of our chat today, the place where we learn most clearly the kind of boons or the kind of powers or the kind of results, one might say, that one achieves by having accomplished the Hekhalot praxis are the Gedulah hymns of Synopsis 81 to 86 of Hekhalot Rabbati. These are a series of hymns basically, they're basically humble bragging. They're humble bragging about how great the descenders are, as of course being written by a descender. So this is all about very much descending, showing how great the descenders are as told by the descenders themselves. But the Gedulah hymns offer up several glimpses into the various powers that one achieves in the process of having witnessed the divine throne. One gains knowledge of the future, so you gain some kind of powers of divination. Again, getting that close to the divine also gets you close to what is called the pargod, the curtain that separates this world from the other. And we learn in the Gemara, in the Talmud, that God basically discusses with the angels what's going to go on in the future. And if you get close enough to the pargod, or if you get behind the pargod, you can actually hear God and the angels planning, and you can kind of know what's coming. This famously happens to Elisha ben Abuya, who learns that he will never be redeemed, and then he goes out and does bad things because he knows there's no hope for him. You also learn about the deeds of others. So you learn about people's deeds, and especially about their sins. And the Hekhalot literature is very interested in people's sexual sins. Now, I don't know what it is about this literature that makes this literature so interested in people's genealogies and if they're born under certain sexual misconduct, but the literature is very fascinated by this. So there are two categories that the texts are very interested in terms of knowing whether or not your origin is either as a mamzer. A mamzer is a person who was born from an illicit sexual union according to Judaism, according to Jewish law. For instance, if a brother and a sister were to have a child, that child would be a mamzer. And of course, mamzerim are excluded from being married to other Israelites, and therefore they can only marry other mamzerims. Another category less severe than that of being born as a mamzer is a person born what is called b'nai nida. And b'nai nida is when a person is conceived after the period of menstruation, but before being declared tahor, a woman being declared clean by having done the mikvah. So this is a liminal space where the woman is not still menstruating and not yet ritually fit for having sex again. And so a person who's born b'nai nida is always thought of as having some of the so-called impurity of the cycle of nida. So being born b'nai nida is considered not good, and those people are thought of as less than in the rabbinical imagination. But chief among the sins that the Merkavah mystics seem to be able to identify once they've successfully done this descent is that they're able to distinguish who is engaged in kishuf, in sorcery. And so this is an interesting thing because in some sense that means that they do not think of themselves as engaging in kishuf, as in sorcery. Of course, kishuf is forbidden. It's usher according to Jewish law. It is a death penalty case. You can be executed for it. And therefore, it's very important to be able to diagnose who does kishuf and who doesn't. And there are long discussions of this in texts like the Talmud and Tractate Sanhedrin. Some great discussions there about Sefer Yetzirah and stuff as well. At any rate, they claim to know who is doing in the community kishuf, who is doing sorcery. And I think this is sort of where thou dost protest too much, because it seems like to me that if you look at the Hekhalot literature, it looks a lot like magic. And we'll be discussing the interconnectedness between Eastern Mediterranean magic and Jewish magic with the Hekhalot literature in a couple of weeks. Actually, I recorded the lecture yesterday, but because of the insanity of all these recordings, it'll come out later. But at any rate, they're connected. There is a historical literary connection between Hekhalot literature and both Jewish magic and the broader world of Eastern Mediterranean magic. But the text imagines themselves as being distinct from those who practice kishuf, and therefore being able to diagnose who engages in sorcery is one of the unique boons said to be had of the descenders. Along with this, we also get other kinds of protections. One gets protections from one's enemies, including legal protection. You get protection from legal threats. You get glorified and set apart. You become somehow famous in a certain kind of way. Your name is known in Israel, as it says. So you become glorified and kind of set apart. You undergo kind of a purification. You're like silver in a refiner's fire and Eshmat Saref. So you become purified in a way that's different than the general population. And of course, you get a sort of generalized angelic protection. Now, again, if you remember back to the nature of the Hekhalot angels, this is no small thing. Who wouldn't want to have the protection of the angels described in the Hekhalot literature? They are positively terrifying. I mean, it makes the Russian mob look like Elmo. I would definitely like to have protection of Hekhalot angels. So if these are your sort of angelic bodyguards in the case of Hatspiel and Dumael and these other horrifying angels, that is not a small thing to have access to. Further, you become really elevated in Israelite society. And this is also this whole business of being glorified, but you become highly elevated. And when I say highly elevated, you become elevated to the point where you only have to stand up before three people. And as you may know, in Israelite customs, the idea was if a person of higher social rank came into the room with you, you had to stand up once they came into the room with you. This is still followed in the yeshiva community, where, for instance, if the Rosh Yeshiva comes in, then everyone stands up. So, our famous rabbis and things like this. So, this is kavod harav, that you're supposed to show deference to those like the rabbinical figures. But this text says that you only have to stand up before three people: before the king of Israel, before the high priest of Israel, and before the Sanhedrin. And that's conspicuous because none of those exist at the time that this text is written down. There is no king in Israel. There is no high priest because the temple's been destroyed. And further, there is no Sanhedrin because that was also liquidated once the temple was destroyed as well, basically. So, in some sense, you go from being just a normal old Israelite to being an Israelite of such stature that there's no one in the world comparable to you. Everyone must stand up to you, and you don't have to stand up to anyone aside from a king who isn't there, a high priest who isn't there, and the Sanhedrin, which doesn't exist anymore. So, it's quite an extraordinary claim. And again, there's a bit of humble bragging here because it says, oh, well, there are people that you have to stand up before, a king or a high priest or the Sanhedrin, but those don't exist anymore. So it's kind of a hamavein yavin kind of thing that if you know, you know, that you have to know that this is a way of basically establishing that there's nobody superior to you in Israel. So this is you get social standing over and against everyone else. But of course, the kind of boons that one gains, the kind of powers that one gains, I think are most famously laid out in Hekhalot Zutarti at Synopsis 349. And it tells us, right? And what mortal person is able to do these things? To ascend on high, to ride on the wheels, the Ophanim, to descend below, to search out the inhabited world. You get some sort of pan-optic sense of what's going on in the world, which we'll see more about in just a moment. To walk on the dry land, to gaze at his splendor, to gaze at the divine splendor, to dwell with his crown, to be transformed by his glory, to recite praise, to engage in the Unio Liturgica, to combine letters. This is the idea that one is able to combine letters for magical effect, an idea that we find eventually in the Sefer Yetzirah and other kinds of text. To recite their names, I'm presuming this is angelic names, to have a vision of what is above, to have a vision of what is below, to know the explanation to the living. That idea that you have a vision of what is above and below, that's a bit Maaseh Bereshit kind of knowledge. To know the explanation to the living, to see the vision of the dead, one would see the vision of the dead, although that's only really recorded in Third Enoch. To walk in the rivers of fire, to the rivers of Region, to know the lightning, the barak, and able to explain it, and who is able to see it. So this is a rhetorical question. The answer is who is able to explain it and who is able to see it? Well, the answer is the descenders. The descenders are able to explain it because they have to once they've successfully descended and they've been able to see it. They've been able to experience this. So this is a very beautiful poem at Synopsis 349 that lays out sort of in a very seriatim form all of the various powers that one gains when one has successfully descended. Another unusual story, and perhaps one of the most singular unusual stories in the Hekhalot literature, is that the descenders were able to gain access to world affairs. Again, God and the angels are up there behind the pargod, behind the throne. They're up there planning for what's about to happen. They're planning for the future. It's sort of like a committee of future planning events. But they're up there planning, and if you can get access to behind the pargod, you can kind of learn what's about to happen in the world. And this is especially on display in the version of what is called the 10 Martyrs, as it's recorded in Hekhalot Rabbati, which is unlike any other version of the myth of the 10 Martyrs that we find in rabbinical literature. The myth of the 10 Martyrs is or story of the 10 Martyrs, I shouldn't say myth, but the story of the 10 Martyrs is that Rome ultimately martyrs 10 different famous rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, for instance, and their stories of their martyrdom and their horrifying tortures are recorded in these martyrologies, and they're recited on to two distinct days of the year. They're recited on Yom Kippur Day, and they're recited on Tish B'Av, the day of mourning. So they are prototypical martyrs, of which all of Jewish martyrs are in some sense joined in communion with their martyrdom. But we have a version of the 10 martyrs as it's recorded in Hekhalot, and it is bonkers. So Rome seems to issue a warrant, an arrest warrant for 4 rabbis. So as soon as Rome issues an arrest warrant for these 4 rabbis, Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana orders Rabbi Ishmael to descend, to make the descent, and to go into the heavenly palaces and see what's going on. So Rabbi Ishmael does the descent. He enters into the inner sanctum, into the world of the Hekhalot, and he meets with the angel Surya. And Surya says that basically the divine court has reached a deal with Samael, the angel or demon, the angel that represents the Roman Empire, the Prince of Rome. And what deal that they've struck is this, that the heavenly court will allow Rome to kill 10 prominent men in exchange for the destruction of the Roman Empire. So they basically said, look, we will allow you to kill 10 rabbis if the entire Roman Empire falls apart, if the entire Roman Empire is collapsed. And so apparently the angel Samael, the angel of the Prince of Rome, has made this deal, but there's a trick involved in all this. The trick, of course, is that they're going to bluff the entire thing and the 10 rabbis won't be killed and somehow Rome will be destroyed anyway. But at any rate, this deal is struck and the rabbis are turned over to Rome, and God begins to produce an edict of destruction against the Roman Empire, against the city of Rome specifically. And what ends up happening is all these skin diseases begin to descend on Rome, and it afflicts the entire people. You're getting Exodus vibes, I'm sure, from this, right? Sort of Pharaoh and Exodus with the plagues. But there's a Caesar here, which is not recounted in any other Roman literature so far as I know of, who's named Lupinus Caesar. Now, in the traditional text, I believe the Roman emperor who makes the edict of the killing of the 10 martyrs is actually Hadrian, who is, of course, a historical Roman emperor. But in this story, it's this otherwise unknown leader of Rome, Emperor Rome, Lupinus. And all of his family are struck down. His wife and his children are all struck down. And in fact, when their bodies are attempted to be buried, the earth vomits their bodies back up and they're left to rot in the sun. But ultimately, when the descenders hear that all this sort of deal has been struck and that the 10 rabbis actually won't be killed, it'll be a trick, as we'll get to in just a minute, they have a party. They are celebrating the fact that basically God has undermined the Roman Empire. Now, why God has to go through all these shenanigans to undo the Roman Empire is a good question, but at any rate, that's what the story is. And so Lupinus Caesar is apparently killed, his family is killed, and the city of Rome is being afflicted with all these skin diseases. And of course, the descendants throw a big party. But Ishmael learns that from the angel Surya that the edict was apparently because Caesar targeted a very specific rabbi, Rabbi Hananiah ben Tardion. But this is where the trick happens, the subterfuge happens. Rabbi Hananiah ben Tardion is actually transformed to look like Lupinus Caesar, who's dead, and then he's about to be resurrected. So Lupinus Caesar and Rabbi Tardion are switched places. And so what ends up happening is that while Rabbi Tardion, who looks like Lupinus Caesar, is in power, he kills 6,000 Roman generals. So he just decapitates the Roman army. So this rabbi who is shapeshifted into apparently looking like this Caesar has killed 6,000 Roman generals. And then Caesar, while Rabbi Tardion is transformed into looking like Lupinus Caesar is transformed to look like each of the 10 rabbis to be martyred. And what happens is that he is transformed into Rabbi 1, that rabbi is burned to death, and then his body is resurrected. He's made to look like Rabbi 2. That rabbi is burned to death, although in the traditional martyrology, they all get killed in all kinds of other horrifying, elaborate ways. They're not all burned to death. Some of them are beheaded or raped with things and skinned alive and stuff like that, of course. But in this version, they're all burned to death. But in this version, again, Rabbi Tardion is basically, or rather, Lupinus Caesar is shapeshifted into each of the rabbis to be killed. He's killed and revived 10 times. And then Rome is destroyed, and the 10 martyrs who are supposed to be killed in the traditional martyrology aren't killed at all. So this story is just bonkers. It doesn't make any sense. There was no historical Lupinus Caesar. We have no idea who that was. Rome was clearly not destroyed in the 3rd century, or the 2nd century, rather. Rome clearly wasn't destroyed. It was actually reaching its apex in the 2nd century. So clearly Rome wasn't destroyed in the 2nd century. And further, this makes it such that the story of the 10 martyrs didn't even happen. They weren't martyred at all. It was just some Caesar shapeshifting and being tortured in the entire time. So this is just like a huge, like, what the, you know? But again, it shows you that the 10 martyr story in Hekhalot Rabbati is just being interfaced with the Hekhalot literature in a way to show just how powerful the descenders are. The descenders are now the machers. They're now the ones controlling world affairs. And while God and Surya and Samael are all striking their deals, these rabbis are the ones actually in control. So this is a strange, bizarre Hekhalot fantasy that somehow has Rome being destroyed in the 3rd century, or 2nd century, which clearly didn't happen. The martyrs not being martyred, so it's not really the 10 martyrs anymore because it's just Lupinus Caesar being resurrected. And then, of course, all of this is supposed to do what exactly? And then the text moves on as if nothing's happened. So this is a positively bizarre story put into our traditional story, made bizarre by the Hekhalot literature. Who else to make it bizarre than the descenders? But a bizarre story, a bizarre narrative put into Hekhalot Rabbati. And I have no idea. I mean, even Davila talks about the fact that the text is so corrupt in some places, it's not even clear what's happening. So a perplexing story to be found in Hekhalot Rabbati, and one that I think does enormous violence to the actual history of people who were martyred by the Romans, and reshapes the story into a bizarre, mystical revenge fantasy where Romans destroyed and the martyrs aren't martyred and things like this. So clearly a text being underwritten primarily by the psychology and the revisionist sort of fantasies of the descenders, perhaps centuries later, living in Babylon, as opposed to, of course, a historical or quasi-historical narrative of actual Jewish martyrs who perished in the Roman persecutions. Of course, as I mentioned in another lecture, there are dozens of these boons that one gains from doing the Hekhalot praxis, and not just sort of interacting in world affairs, but one gains a great name, you have excellent memory retention, you get powers over the forces of nature, various forms of theurgy, you're granted wishes, you get the binding of an Aphiel. There's all kinds of mysteries of Sandalphon, protection from angels, angels that protect you, adjurations for Metatron, invocations for all kinds of angels. The literature is just packed in Hekhalot Zatarti, especially in Maseh Rabbah, Maseh Bereshit, but it's just packed with these adjurations that give the descenders various kinds of powers. So along with just gazing on the divine throne, you also are gained access to enormous magical, metaphysical, supernatural, whatever you want to call them, powers, many of which I've laid out here in this slide that gives you some sense of a huge amount of different kinds of powers. But of course, at the core of the Merkavah mysticism, one of the central desires of all of this, and even as a result of having gazed on the divine throne, is gaining access to what the text calls sitrei chokhmah. Sitrei chokhmah. That is to say, secrets of wisdom. That is the core thing that the descenders want to have access to, as the sitrei chokhmah. And in this way, the text is Gnostic in a sense. That is to say, one of the goals is a kind of knowledge. But it's not Gnostic in the sense that the knowledge that one gains is soteriological. It's not salvific. Again, by the time that you've engaged in the descent, you've well qualified for the world to come. But what you do get access to are these secrets. And this is sort of at odds inside the text, where one seems to gain access to secrets, but one seems to need to know secrets in order to do the praxis at all. We get a kind of chicken and the egg problem. But at the core of how to gain that knowledge, or to gain these sitrei chokhmah, is two texts. One of which is the Sartorah literature, the angel of the Torah, whereby one conjures an angel by which to gain access to mystical and non-mystical knowledge, just regular exoteric knowledge, but also perhaps the most esoteric bit of knowledge to be gained
in all of this. As I mentioned back in the beginning, in most cases, the description of the divine body is not given, except for when it is. And when it is, it produces the most bizarre text in Jewish history. And that text is the Shiur Komah, the measurement of the stature. And in the Shiur Komah, we see the dimensions of the divine body measured down to very specific measurements. The divine beard is measured, the space between the divine eyebrows, the length of the divine arm, the space of the divine ankles, everything. Everything is measured and given very specific magical, mystical names. So, in order to understand those two elements of the Merkavah mysticism and how the Sartora literature and the Sartora praxis and literature and the Shiur Komah literature come together and interact with this ascent literature or descent literature, we might say, we need to pay more specific attention to those two texts, to the Sartora text and praxis and to the Shiur Komah text, which is extremely strange. And in order to do those, we need to unpack them over the course of the next lecture. And it is to that next lecture that we will turn to the angel of the Torah, that rather than going into the world of the Hekhalot, one summons the angel to you. And by extension, once one does that, one goes to the world of the Hekhalot, and by gazing at the divine throne, one is given a glimpse of the divine body in a form and detail otherwise utterly unknown and horrifying to the Jewish imagination. A text so polarizing that Maimonides' Guide the Perplexed may have been written to counter this form of mysticism, and by extension, insofar as the response to Maimonides was the development of the Kabbalah. We could even say that the Shiur Komah, as a literature, is indirectly responsible for the development of the Kabbalah beginning in the 13th century. But to unpack that, we need to return next time to the Sartora literature and to the Shiur Komah.